for a fascinating talk. I hope that everybody enjoyed it as much as I did. And please, I think that was very stimulating and also provocative that we follow the same rules as like most mammals or even birds. So I believe that there will be much to discuss. So I would like ask from audience some question, and till you write it, or so I would like to ask, which is probably the not very creative question that you are ready already. So what is the phylogenetic pattern then, and how to control for it? Because it can be that many of these like litter size and parental care and so on is phylogenetically very conserved. So how we know that it's not driven by Afrotheria or bats which have one or few offspring and so on. So how do you control for it? And also the relatedness among human societies, that it's not like it's really environmentally driven.
Yeah. So yeah, there are two parts to this. So the first part is just to look across the different mammalian species to understand how potentially the difference in life history explain. And like you said, it could just be that, yeah, primates are different because they have different life history from rodents, and also behavior just might be different. So in these correlation analyses, we always include the relatedness in terms of phylogeny, so the shared phylogenetic history among species, to control for the fact that species might just be similar because they all had a recent common ancestor. And we also usually try to do the reconstruction. So what I showed before is that, right, I mean, it's much more likely to find group living in species where females have single offspring. We also did phylogenetic reconstructions to show that it's about 15 times more likely that you will see group living evolve in a lineage where females produce single offspring than in a lineage where females produce litters of offspring. So we can really also show this directionality. It could also potentially be the other way around, right? It could be that if you're in a group, you're now experiencing a competition, so you change your investment. But what we actually looked at with the phylogenetic history is to show like, no, it's usually the other way around. Once females produce single offspring, then group living is much more likely to happen. For these other analyses where we looked at the similarity in behavior, humans and other species, you're right, it's a bit confounding now because we have the relatedness among the human societies, and we have relatedness among the species that live next to each other as well. And so we tried two different ways to control for that. So the one thing we did is we had the information about a human society and we knew which environment they lived on. And so we looked at a different place on the Earth where it's a very similar ecological condition. So I think we looked for same climate, same altitude, and same latitude. So we found another place on the Earth. There was a similar environment that this one human society had. And then we asked, what do the mammals and birds do here? And does it still match the behavior that we observe in this human society? And so we did that for all the 340 human societies. We just put them on a different place on Earth and just checked, okay, in these environments, are the species still behaving the same? And yes, they are. So it really seems to be something in the environment. Because we now move the societies randomly around the world, we break up this pattern of relatedness. Because now the societies that would be next to each other in North America are found in very different parts of the world, just in the same environment. And it's still the environment that then matches their behavior to that behavior of the species that live there. So that's one way how we thought of breaking this up. And we also had other ways where we include the shared history in the predictors just to see that our patterns aren't driven by this inflation in sample size because, you know, sample lots and lots of related species. And also our results are robust to that.
Okay, thank you very much. I saw that it's well controlled, so yeah, I trust it now. And before others have a question, so I would like to ask, so how general is the relationship between calories per day spent in offspring and offspring number? So it relates probably only to lactation or parental care in birds, yeah, but because it is only like related to parental behavior and not for production of eggs or like just offspring to birds, yeah.
Yes. So yeah, the data I showed are really for rodents, and they're usually then looking at individuals potentially and how individuals change their investments. So we also don't, we have to be very careful in how we translate these findings to distantly related species, because as you correctly say, the patterns of investment might happen over other time spans. Like you're producing eggs, that might be a different investment initially because you can then have the male already helping you much sooner than if you have the pregnancy and lactation. So yeah, I don't think we really know, and I think it would be interesting to see. And I haven't looked much at that literature. I'm not sure it necessarily exists. And I think it's the same. I mean, I made these assumptions for the humans in the end, right? Where I said that if women have these really short interbirth intervals, that's potentially more costly than if the interbirth intervals happen at longer time spans. I'm not sure about that either. And I think it's something that would be interesting to look at as well. Is like in humans, we have this interesting pattern that you have overlapping offspring. That doesn't necessarily happen in many other species either, right? In lots of other species, female would care for one or multiple offspring that she has given birth to until they're independent, and she will only start reproducing then again. Whereas in humans, we have this, females will be pregnant again and already have the next offspring while her previous offspring are still very much dependent on her. And so I also don't know to what extent that might be more like a female producing multiple offspring at once than maybe like a chimpanzee, where female really waits to produce her next offspring. So I also don't know how humans can potentially fit in this because we have this staggered reproduction. I think it would be really interesting to look at that,
Yeah, I was thinking that mostly there is a negative relationship between body size and number of offspring per a given say clutch in mammals, but the pattern is opposite in most other animals. Yeah, that higher body size means higher number of eggs per clutch, so that just mammals have the opposite allometric pattern. So what does it mean for sociality in other animals like teleost fishes or reptiles and so on?
So first, let me apologize. Somebody else is drilling in a building next door. That's what you're hearing in the background. Sorry. I wish it were other animals, but it's just somebody drilling. So I hope you can still understand me, Willis. And then to your question, these two axes of life history variation seem to be relatively consistent across most animal species. That to some extent, the external mortality seems to influence how quickly you reproduce and what your spacing is. And then the resource availability influences that at each reproductive event how much you invest. So if you just look across species and partition the variation, that seems to be true for lots of species. So at least those kinds of patterns are there. I then don't know to what extent we have these exponential increases, but at least the general life history patterns, I think, are relatively robust across the tree of life,
So we answer one question: what is the animal which is like which we can hear from the background? So otherwise, Eva said that it was very interesting talk, and we have a question from Honza Toman. So maybe Honzo, can you ask directly and explain it?
Yeah, okay. If you can return to the slide with gathering and storing resources. You showed there that interesting pattern that human societies behave similarly to other mammals of their environment. But yeah, this is the one. But I noticed that the societies that gather massive quantity of resources doesn't fit in the trend so well. Is it because these are some special societies like states or empires, or why is that?
Sorry. Yes, I think you're right. I mean, I don't know from the top of my head, but yes, there are some societies in there that are really these state societies where you have now organized food storage rather than just individual level household storage. I think these are probably the ones where you can store massive quantities. And if you now organize it in a different way, yes, you're probably already preparing or modifying your environment in a way that goes beyond what you need on your own personal basis. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I wonder whether I can ask a question directly as well.
Sure.
Yeah. Dieter, you mentioned this relationship between kinship, high degree of kinship, and complexity of relationships, which supposed to be what is cognitively demanding on relationships. So how does go together with this a priori expectation of social brain hypothesis that monogamy is what is most demanding cognitively, if your data actually suggests that this other way around, that this egalitarian society with multi-male, multi-female hierarchies should be most demanding in cognitive terms.
Yes, so I think the social relationship hypothesis has changed a lot across years and across whoever is writing about it. And I think in particular, this aspect of monogamy, where people were arguing that, yes, if you have these stable bonds, that came in when people were trying to think about birds. And I think in a few bird species, we have a situation that's potentially similar to humans, where we have these multiple layers, where you have the pairs that are part of a larger group. And I think that's where the argument came from. So it's not just an association of, random individuals, but you need to remember who your partner is in the group and who you've interacted with. And these pairs might interact differently with different other pairs. So I think that's where the idea came from these multi-nested bird species, where you have specific bonds within a larger group. And I think that's, again, what it comes back to what I was describing with the relationship hypothesis as well. But you have, with some individuals, reciprocal relationships, and you form alliances with them. They are the ones who support you in fights against other individuals in the group. So I think you could make the link there, but it's true that in mammals, when we have monogamous species, usually you don't get large groups. So whenever we have monogamy in humans, you either have these cooperative breeders where the groups are really small and everybody is related, or it's really just the pair and maybe some offspring team together. And then they have their own territory and fight against everybody else. So I think we really need to think about what we mean by these terms and how these actual relationships happen. And that's what potentially is the important thing for what individuals have to remember and how they interact, rather than just this broad one way to look at one specific aspect.
Yeah, that makes sense, but I'm afraid that they just quote in these original studies social organization as monogamous and polygamous and so on. So they don't go that far that they would only consider a species that have some nested social organization. They just take all monogamous species in one basket and all polygamous in the other. Yeah, okay, thank you.
I mean, I think the other aspect is it's very human-centric, right? People were looking at what's special in humans, and they were trying to link all of that to our intelligence. And I think that's very fallacious. And I think there are lots of ideas out there which is just based on this, oh yeah, humans are monogamous and smart, and therefore monogamy must be linked to intelligence. And I think that's also part of where these ideas came from. And I don't think actually, if you look at the data, there's any support. I mean, there's this other argument, it's linked to prosociality, where people thought that if you really help each other, that's again something humans do a lot, and that might be linked to brain cells. But again, I don't think the evidence is there either. And again, it potentially goes in the opposite direction. So I think that's where the ideas initially came from, but I don't think they really stand up to the scrutiny of the data. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so before the next question, I can ask again to this fascinating correlation with different mammals and human societies. So can I ask if you think that there is some threshold, like that we we have like 50 kilos, so we are big omnivorous animals which are dependent on vegetation productivity, but also like on hunting and so on. So does it lead to higher similarity with large carnivores or herbivores because we are dependent on them? Or but if you compare, I don't know, like subterranean rodents, there is no such correlation and so on. So where to put the threshold and where to assume that there should be such similarity, and for which particular kind of animals or mammals it should be expected.
We didn't actually look at that. And you're right. I mean, what I showed you in the slides, like what I showed you just now, again, with the food storage, right? When humans store a lot of food, it's usually only still 50% of the local mammals that store food. And then for these kinds of traits, it would be interesting to go back and see which mammals are these. Are it really, like you're describing, the ones that have a very similar diet to humans? Or potentially are it the ones that have a very similar, they live on the ground, right? If you live in the trees, you might behave differently than if you just live on the ground or if you live underground. So you might be thinking of these things, but I'm not sure. I mean, we still wanted to see these patterns. And the really fascinating thing is that we have this immense variation across human societies, right? I mean, we basically see this whole spectrum of variation that we see across 5,000 mammals and 10,000 birds across humans. And so I think humans are really, really flexible. And so I think it's difficult to then to say what you're describing now, this human universal, but human is trying to go back to say like, okay, humans are this size and behave in a certain way. Well, we find this immense variation. So I think it's also really difficult then to go back and say, this is typically human. And that's what we should focus on if we find other species that are similar. And so I think that was the fascinating aspect as well, just to say that, no, I mean, humans can change their behavior wherever they go, and they now might be similar to a whole another set of species in this environment than to the set of species they're similar to over here.
Okay, thank you very much. We are enormously flexible, which makes us so dangerous. So is there any other question, please? If not, last chance to ask.
So maybe I will ask one more question, which is actually not directly connected to the talk, but you probably have screened many human populations and their characteristics. So I would be interested in variation in number of members of these societies and how much it is like similar to what would be expected by Dunbar number, by this 100, 150 person per society. So what's the range of these society members in human societies, especially in these hunter-gatherer societies?
So the first thing is, again, that I think it's really difficult in humans to define what's the boundary of a group. In other species, that's relatively simple. You just see these individuals interacting. They're just in the group. They forage together. And it's the same set of individuals from one year to the next, from one year to the next. In humans, as I said, we have this nested structure. You know, you easily go beyond. And the question is, where is the boundary? When do we say, okay, this is the group you belong to? And people have applied this concept very differently. And that was also difficult then actually for these comparisons, where we noticed in these comparative data sets, some people described the group as the number of individuals you forage with on a given day. And that's usually quite low. Other researchers described it really as the society, everybody who speaks the same language. And then these numbers can be in the thousands. Other people again described it as the village, so where you come back to and where you have your relationship. So I think the first problem is we don't have this clear definition of what's a group, and that makes it really difficult to make these comparisons. I think if we think about these other numbers, I think the actual real core set of individuals that people in these hunter-gatherer societies interact with is really low. I think it's well below the 150 that Dunbar sometimes seems to assume. My assumption is that it's actually more on the level of 40 to 50. So I think I'm not entirely, again, like he might argue differently and he classify it differently, but yeah, the problem is how do you actually define who your group is? But I think if we think about it of the number of individuals you regularly interact with, it's usually actually not that high.
Thank you. That's what I expected.
Thank you. Meanwhile, we have one more question. Kristina Kverková is asking whether there are any traits that you look at and you did not find a correlation between humans and other animals. Is there any such notable characteristics?
Yes, so we in total looked at 16 different behaviors, and I showed you data for 14. For 2 of them, we didn't find a relationship, and the 2 are actually group size. And again, I think the problem was that group size was so differently defined that we didn't find a relationship between group size of humans and group size of mammals and birds. And the other one is whether men or women move when they marry to go to another place. So whether we have female phallopatry or male phallopatry, we also did not find a signal for that. I mean, one other factor we looked at, just because everybody always talks about it and we just wanted to look at something non-behavior, we also looked at body size. And body size, we also did not find a signal. So it's not that humans are larger in areas where the mammals and the birds are larger. So we just wanted to have one of these physiological body size factors in there, but there we didn't also find it yet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for Christina for interesting question and you for answer. So if Christina doesn't have some follow-up question, so if not, so we have here one more note that it was really interesting talk, and so I think it's the feeling of all of us. So thank you very much once more, and it was a big pleasure, and I think we will all think about it for a long time. So thank you, and
thank you.
We can finalize the official part of the Biological Thursday.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So thanks to all for coming, and come the next week as well.
Yeah, and thank you.